It started out as just another trip, a solo vacation I'd been planning for months. Ever since I could remember, I loved traveling alone. I'd been all over quiet beach towns, bustling cities and remote mountains, but this time I wanted something different. I wanted to find a small, peaceful place to retreat for a weekend and recharge. After a quick search on Airbnb, I found it. A quaint cabin nestled in the woods of a small town I'd never heard of before. The photos looked perfect: cozy rooms, a beautiful view of the forest, and total seclusion. It seemed like a dream come true. The cabin had great reviews, too. The host, Tom, was described as attentive but not intrusive. Tom leaves you alone, one review read. It's the perfect place for some peace and quiet. It was exactly what I was looking for. And without giving it a second thought, I booked my weekend getaway. After a long drive, I arrived at the cabin late on Friday evening. As promised, the place was charming. The wooden porch overlooked a sprawling forest, and the inside was just as cozy as the photos had promised. There were warm lights, soft blankets, and rustic decorations that gave the place a comforting atmosphere. Everything seemed perfect, except for the gnawing sensation that had followed me since I parked my car. At first, I thought it was just travel fatigue, the kind that settles in after hours of driving on lonely roads. The woods around the cabin were thick and quiet, almost unnaturally so. The feeling of being watched was subtle, like an itch at the back of my mind. I shrugged it off as nothing more than nerves and settled in for the night. The first night passed without incident. I woke up refreshed, ready to enjoy the peaceful solitude. I spent the morning reading, drinking coffee on the porch, and walking through the woods. But the feeling of being watched lingered, making me glance over my shoulder every few minutes. I convinced myself it was just paranoia. The cabin had all the amenities I needed: a fully stocked kitchen, cozy living room, a nice bathroom with an old-fashioned clawfoot tub. That evening, after a long walk, I decided to take a hot bath. The water was soothing, the steam rising in gentle swirls as I relaxed. But halfway through, I felt it again, stronger this time, the sensation that eyes were on me. It was an oppressive, invasive feeling, making my skin crawl. I scanned the room, looking for something, anything, that could explain it. But it was just a bathroom, normal as could be. Shaking my head, I tried to push the feeling away, chalking it up to the eerie isolation. But it wouldn't go. I hurried through the rest of my bath, towel dried, and slipped into my pajamas, all while fighting the persistent dread settling in my stomach. The cabin felt different that night, as if the comforting atmosphere had shifted. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the trees outside made me jump. I couldn't relax. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now, more than just a passing thought. It was real, tangible. My instincts screamed that something wasn't right. I told myself I was being irrational, but my unease continued to build. I went around the cabin, double-checking all the locks, closing the curtains, and even turning on more lights than necessary. I knew it was ridiculous. I was safe, wasn't I? But then something strange happened. As I was about to head back to bed, I glanced at the mirror in the bathroom. My breath caught. There was something off about the way the tiles behind me were reflecting in the mirror. I stepped closer and leaned in, squinting. It was then that I saw it. Nestled between two tiles, barely noticeable, was a small, dark hole. My heart began to race. I reached out, touching the tiles, my fingers trembling. That's when I found it, a tiny, nearly invisible camera, cleverly hidden in the bathroom wall. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. My stomach twisted as the full weight of what I'd just found hit me. Someone had been watching me this whole time. My mind flooded with images of every moment I thought I was alone, undressing, bathing, relaxing in what I thought was privacy. Every vulnerable second was captured by this disgusting, hidden camera. I felt sick, violated, and terrified all at once. I needed to get out of there. Now. Grabbing my phone, I searched for a signal, but the cabin was too remote. Of course it was. Panic surged through me as I realized how isolated I truly was. I felt trapped, my skin crawling with the thought that someone could be watching me right now. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I ran to my car, fumbling with the lock. But as I reached for the handle, I froze. Someone was standing at the edge of the forest. A figure, cloaked in shadows, barely visible in the dim light of the porch lamp, watching me. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. My heart, already racing, now felt like it might explode. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still, at the edge of the trees, blending in with the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, a face, clothing, nothing. But I knew in that instant that whoever or whatever was there had been watching me the whole time. The moment stretched on for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced with thoughts of the hidden camera, of this person lurking in the woods, and of what they might want. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was almost suffocating now. I gripped my keys so tightly they dug into my palm, the metal biting into my skin, grounding me to the moment. Run. That was the only thought that broke through the panic. I needed to get in the car and get out of there. My hand fumbled for the door handle, shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure, afraid that if I did, they would rush toward me. I was terrified that the second I looked away, they would be on me. But just as I was about to pull open the door, the figure moved. It wasn't a slow, menacing approach. It was a sudden lunge, a quick, jerky movement toward the cabin, toward me. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. I yanked the door open, threw myself into the driver's seat, and locked the doors in one fluid motion. My fingers scrambled to start the engine, and I could feel the figure drawing closer, could hear the soft crunch of gravel underfoot as they approached. The engine sputtered to life just as I saw the figure's hand slap against the passenger side window. A muffled thud echoed inside the car as the hand slid down the glass, leaving a greasy smear in its wake. I screamed, slamming the car into reverse, and sped backward, barely checking my surroundings. The tires skidded on the gravel driveway, and I swerved, nearly crashing into a tree. But I didn't care. I didn't care about anything except getting away. I gunned it down the narrow dirt road that led away from the cabin, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The dark, winding road stretched out before me, the headlights barely illuminating the dense woods on either side. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure running after me, but the road was empty. I drove for what felt like hours, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, trying to process everything that had just happened. The hidden camera, the figure in the woods, the hand on the window. My mind kept spinning, searching for answers, but nothing made sense. Finally, when I was far enough from the cabin, I pulled over on the side of the road, my hands trembling. I grabbed my phone, praying I'd get a signal out here in the middle of nowhere. After a moment of frantic searching, I saw a single bar appear at the top of the screen. I immediately dialed 911. It took what felt like an eternity for the operator to pick up, and when they did, my words came out in a jumbled, panicked mess. There's someone was watching me. I found a camera in the bathroom. There's someone at the cabin, please. I don't know what to do. The operator tried to calm me down, but I was too far gone. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting the figure to materialize out of the darkness behind me. After giving them the address of the cabin, They assured me that a local sheriff would be dispatched to check it out. They told me to stay on the line, to stay calm, but how could I? I was shaking uncontrollably, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I don't know how long I sat there on the side of the road waiting for anyone to show up. But when the flashing blue and red lights finally appeared in the distance, I felt a small, fleeting sense of relief. The sheriff's car pulled up behind me, and an officer stepped out, shining a flashlight into my car. I rolled down the window, my voice still shaky as I tried to explain what had happened. There was someone at the cabin. They were watching me. There was a camera in the bathroom. I don't know who it was, but they tried to get into my car. The officer listened, his expression serious, and asked me to follow him back to the cabin so they could investigate. The idea of going back there made my stomach churn, but I had no choice. I followed his car down the winding road, my headlights cutting through the darkness once again. The fear crept back into me with every passing mile, a cold, sinking feeling that only grew stronger as we approached the cabin. When we arrived, the officer told me to stay in the car while he checked the area. I watched as he walked up to the porch, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. He disappeared inside the cabin, and I was left alone in the silence of the night, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes passed. Then more. I stared at the cabin, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if the figure was still inside? What if something had happened to the officer? What if? The sound of a door creaking open snapped me out of my thoughts. The officer stepped out onto the porch, his face unreadable in the dim light. He walked back to my car, tapping on the window. I rolled it down, my hands still shaking. "There's no one inside," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I didn't find any cameras." I blinked, my mind struggling to process what he had just said. What? But I saw it. I found the camera in the bathroom right behind the tiles. I checked the bathroom thoroughly, he interrupted. "There's nothing there." My heart sank. It felt like the world was spinning out of control. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? But I saw someone, I whispered, my voice barely audible. They were standing right there by the trees. They touched my car. I saw their hand on the window. The officer glanced at the passenger side window, then back at me. "There's no sign of anyone being here. No footprints, no handprints, nothing." I felt the weight of his words settling in, suffocating me. How could that be possible? I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. But the officer's calm, measured tone made me doubt myself. Had it all been in my head? "I'll file a report," he said, his voice softer now, almost sympathetic. "But my advice? Maybe take a break from staying in such isolated places. It can mess with your head." He turned and walked back to his car, leaving me sitting there in stunned silence. As he drove away, the reality of the situation crashed down on me. I was alone again, in the middle of nowhere, with no explanation for what had happened. I didn't go back to the cabin. I drove straight home, my mind a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and doubt. The image of the hidden camera, the figure in the woods, the hand on the window, all of it haunted me, replaying over and over in my mind. And then, one night, as I was going through the photos on my phone, something caught my eye. A picture I didn't remember taking. It was blurry, taken from a strange angle, almost as if it had been captured accidentally. But in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a reflection in the bathroom mirror. And standing behind me in the shadows was the figure, watching. It had been years since Lily and I took time for ourselves. Between demanding jobs, bills, and the mundane routines of life, We felt the distance growing between us. The spark that had once defined our relationship was slowly fading. So when I suggested we take a weekend away, just the two of us, to reconnect and escape the chaos of our daily lives, Lily was on board immediately. We chose a cabin in the woods, far removed from the hustle of the city. I found it online, a charming little place tucked away in the foothills of a mountain range. It had all the rustic allure we were looking for: a wood-burning fireplace, large windows overlooking a dense forest, and just enough isolation to give us that sense of adventure without being completely cut off from civilization. The drive up was beautiful. Winding roads through autumn-colored trees, the crisp air of early fall, and the promise of a peaceful weekend. Lily smiled more than I had seen in months, and I felt hopeful. This weekend would fix everything. When we finally arrived at the cabin, I was struck by how perfect it seemed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch, and the place looked exactly like the pictures online, quaint, inviting, and serene. I parked the car, unloaded our bags, and we both took in the fresh, pine-scented air. We spent the first few hours settling in, opening a bottle of wine and exploring the property. There was a small lake about half a mile from the cabin, and we walked hand in hand to the water's edge, the world around us quiet and peaceful. It was exactly what we needed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped, and we made our way back to the cabin. I started a fire, and we cooked dinner, enjoying each other's company in a way we hadn't in a long time. It was perfect. My name is Jason. I'm 33 years old, a middle school teacher by profession, and a man who thought he had life figured out, until recently. Lily and I have been together for almost 7 years, married for 2. We met in college, both of us young and full of ambition. She became a graphic designer, and I found my calling in education. Our lives were busy but fulfilling, at least at first. But somewhere along the line, things changed. The spark that once burned so brightly between us had dimmed. We stopped talking, really talking, and instead focused on work, bills, and the everyday grind. I could feel us drifting apart, but I didn't know how to fix it. This weekend, though, was supposed to be a fresh start. Lily was always the adventurous one, pushing me to try new things, to explore the world outside my comfort zone. I had a tendency to play it safe, to stay within the familiar, but she had this way of pulling me out of my shell. I loved her for that, and I wanted to remind her of that love this weekend. But I never could have imagined how quickly things would unravel. After dinner, we sat by the fire, the warmth wrapping around us like a comforting embrace. The sound of the crackling wood, the soft glow of the flames, and the glass of wine in my hand, all of it made me feel more at ease than I had in a long time. Lily curled up next to me, her head resting on my shoulder, and for the first time in months, I felt close to her again. We talked about nothing and everything, the kind of conversations we used to have before life became so complicated. We laughed, we reminisced, and for a few hours, it felt like we were back to our old selves. The cabin had a kind of charm that made it easy to forget the outside world. It felt safe, cozy, and isolated in the best possible way. No phones, no emails, no distractions, just the two of us. I was beginning to think that this weekend was exactly what we needed to reignite the flame that had been flickering. But that sense of comfort wouldn't last. It started small, just a faint unease that settled over me as the night wore on. I brushed it off at first, attributing it to the unfamiliar surroundings. The cabin was old, after all, and old places made noises, creaks, groans, the kind of sounds that came with settling wood and drafty windows. Lily went to bed around 11, tired from the long drive, but I stayed up a little longer, enjoying the quiet. I sat by the fire, sipping the last of my wine and staring into the flames. But as the fire died down and the cabin grew darker, that feeling of unease crept back in. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, just a vague sensation that something wasn't quite right. I chalked it up to being in a new place, far from the familiarity of home, and tried to shake it off. But as I sat there alone in the flickering light of the fire, I started to notice things. A strange sound outside, like footsteps crunching on the gravel path leading to the cabin. I froze, listening intently, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. Then the faintest of taps, barely audible, on the window behind me. My heart raced and I turned to look, but all I saw was my own reflection in the glass. The firelight danced behind me, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me in the quiet of the night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't as alone as we thought. I locked the door and made my way to the bedroom, where Lily was already fast asleep. I climbed into bed beside her, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside the cabin seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there. The next morning I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of birds chirping outside. The unease of the previous night had faded in the light of day, and I felt foolish for letting my imagination get the better of me. Lily was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she poured coffee into 2 mugs. "Sleep well?" she asked, handing me a cup. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, mostly." She smiled, oblivious to the strange sense of dread that had lingered with me through the night. We spent the day exploring the woods around the cabin, taking pictures by the lake, and enjoying the crisp autumn air. It was exactly the kind of day I had hoped for, peaceful, relaxing, and free of any tension. But as the sun began to set once again, that feeling of unease returned. It was subtle at first, just a vague discomfort that I couldn't explain. I didn't mention it to Lily. I didn't want to ruin the weekend, and I convinced myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. That night, after another quiet dinner by the fire, we decided to go to bed early. Lily was already asleep when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch outside the cabin. My blood ran cold. I lay perfectly still, listening intently. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking back and forth just outside the door. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? We were miles away from the nearest town, and we hadn't seen anyone else since we arrived. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, we were too far into the woods for reliable service. My heart raced as I quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lily. I moved toward the window, trying to get a glimpse of whoever was out there. But when I pulled back the curtain, there was no one. The footsteps had stopped. For a moment I thought I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me again. But then, just as I was about to turn away from the window, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was too dark to make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A person, standing there, watching the cabin. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I wake Lily? Call the police? But there was no signal, and we were miles away from help. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. And then, the door handle rattled. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my body going cold with fear. Someone was trying to get in. I rushed to the door, locking it just as the handle twisted again. Whoever was out there was persistent. They were trying to force their way inside. My mind raced. I grabbed the nearest object, a fire poker, and stood by the door, ready to defend myself. But after a few agonizing moments, the rattling stopped. Silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. But the footsteps didn't return. The door didn't rattle again. Eventually, I mustered the courage to look outside, but there was no one there. The figure at the edge of the trees was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told Lily everything. At first, she thought I was overreacting, that I had imagined it all in the dark of the night. But when I showed her the scratches on the door, deep, jagged marks where the intruder had tried to force their way in, her face went pale. We packed up immediately. The romantic getaway was over. As we drove away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. But there was no one. We never found out who or what had tried to break in that night. Maybe it was a drifter, someone who had stumbled upon the cabin by chance. Or maybe it was something else, something far more sinister. I'll never know for sure. But one thing is certain, I'll never forget the feeling of those watchful eyes in the darkness and the sound of the door handle rattling in the dead of night. I've always loved staying in unique, remote Airbnbs. Old houses, quirky architecture, anything that offered more than just a basic hotel stay. So when I found a listing for an Airbnb in a small, secluded New England town, it felt like a perfect fit. The description called it the Winthrop House, a grand Victorian manor built in the 1800s, fully restored but still maintaining its historical charm. The photos were stunning. High ceilings, large bay windows, intricate woodwork throughout the house. It was surrounded by trees, adding a layer of isolation, which appealed to me. There were a few reviews mentioning how peaceful and serene the stay was, though there were a couple of comments I dismissed at the time, like the house feels alive or couldn't shake the eerie feeling of being watched. At the time, I thought nothing of it. People tend to exaggerate in old houses. I wasn't looking for a ghost story, just a peaceful place to work and recharge for a long weekend. What I didn't know was that this Airbnb had a history, one the listing conveniently left out. My name is Kaylee, and I work as a freelance writer. After a few months of hectic deadlines, I decided to take a long weekend trip alone to clear my head and get some peace. This Airbnb seemed ideal, quiet, surrounded by nature, and far from the distractions of city life. Plus, the house itself intrigued me. I've always been drawn to old buildings, places that have seen centuries pass them by. I drove up from Boston early in the afternoon and arrived just as the sun began to set. The drive had been peaceful, though as I got closer to the house, the roads became more narrow and overgrown. It felt like I was driving into another world, a place untouched by time. The house was even more impressive in person. The Victorian-style architecture stood tall and proud, though the paint was a bit more faded than I'd expected, and the windows seemed groomier than they had in the listing photos. Still, it had an old-world charm, and I was eager to get inside and start my mini-vacation. I unlocked the door with the key from the lockbox and stepped into the foyer. The interior had a distinctly aged smell, like old wood, dust, and something faintly musty, though not unpleasant. The high ceilings and grand staircase took my breath away. The house was much larger than I'd anticipated. I felt small standing in the center of the foyer, gazing up at the chandelier hanging above me, its crystals catching the fading sunlight that filtered through the large windows. I spent the next hour or so exploring. The house had a large, open living room with ornate furniture, a kitchen that looked like it had been renovated in the 90s, and a dining room that still had an old wooden table and chairs, their surfaces worn smooth from years of use. Upstairs there were 3 bedrooms, each furnished with antique-looking beds, and large wardrobes that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. It was exactly what I had been hoping for. Peaceful, quiet, isolated. As night fell, I made myself some tea and sat in the living room, reading a book one had brought along. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, creating a low, whispering sound that echoed through the house. The sound was oddly comforting, and I found myself relaxing into the old armchair, thinking about how perfect this place was for a weekend retreat. The first night was when things started to feel off. I went to bed around midnight, having spent a few hours writing and relaxing. The bedroom I chose was at the end of the hall, with a view that overlooked the overgrown garden in the backyard. I fell asleep quickly, the sound of the wind in the trees lulling me into a deep sleep. But I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding for no reason I could immediately discern. The room was pitch black, save for the faint light from the moon seeping in through the curtains. At first I thought maybe I had heard something, but everything was silent. No wind, no creaks from the house, just an oppressive, almost suffocating silence. I glanced at my phone. 3:17 a.m. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and went back to sleep, chalking it up to being in a new place. The next morning I woke up to find the wardrobe doors slightly ajar. I didn't remember opening them, but I convinced myself I must have been careless the night before. After all, it was just a wardrobe. As the day went on, the strange feeling from the night before faded, and I spent my time writing, enjoying the quiet of the house. By the afternoon, I had forgotten all about the wardrobe. That night, though, the strange occurrences escalated. It started with the tapping. A faint, rhythmic tap, 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 like someone lightly knocking on the walls. It seemed to be coming from the hallway outside my room. I lay in bed, frozen, straining to listen. Tap, tap, tap. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old houses make noise, right? But the tapping continued, growing louder, more deliberate. I sat up, my heart racing, and flicked on the bedside lamp. The tapping stopped. For a few minutes I sat there, waiting for it to start again, but the house had fallen silent once more. I took a deep breath and tried to relax. I even laughed at myself, thinking how silly I was being. It was just an old house, after all. But just as I was about to turn the lamp off, I heard something else, a low creaking sound, like someone stepping on an old wooden floorboard. And then, another creak, closer this time. It was unmistakable, footsteps. My throat went dry. I was alone in the house. Or at least I was supposed to be. I got out of bed, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone for light. I stepped into the hallway, the air feeling colder than it had moments before. The hallway was dark and silent, but the oppressive feeling of being watched settled over me. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the footsteps had stopped. Telling myself I was just imagining things, I returned to bed, though sleep didn't come easily that night. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange noises, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the tapping or the footsteps. It was the little things. I would leave a door open, only to come back and find it closed. I'd set something down in one room, and when I went back for it, it would be in another. At first I thought I was just being forgetful, but it kept happening. little things that didn't make sense. By the time night fell, I was on edge, jumping at every little sound. The house felt different, like it was waiting for something. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, and the floorboards creaked with every gust. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew there was something else at play. That night, the tapping returned, but this time it was louder, more insistent. It echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls, filling every corner with its eerie rhythm. And then the footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth in the hallway. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my phone and a flashlight, I threw the covers off and stormed into the hallway. I was done playing games. I was going to find whoever was making those sounds and put an end to it. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from my flashlight. The air felt thick, oppressive, like I was walking through water. My footsteps echoed as I made my way down the hall, checking each door, each room, but there was nothing. The house was empty, just as it had been before. But the tapping hadn't stopped. It was louder now, coming from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath my feet. I ran back to my room, my heart racing, and slammed the door shut. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. By the time morning came, I knew I couldn't stay another night. The house didn't want me there, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out why. I packed my things as quickly as I could, barely stopping to grab a cup of coffee before I threw my bags into the car. As I pulled away from the house, I glanced back in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent, still, but I could have sworn I saw someone, standing in the upstairs window, watching me leave. I never went back to the Winthrop house, and I never told anyone what happened. Some things are better left unsaid, and that house had secrets I was glad to leave behind. But sometimes, in the quiet moments just before I fall asleep, I still hear the faint sound of tapping, like something or someone is trying to get in.